Picture this. It's 1953, and the streets of Tehran are erupting in chaos. Mobs surge through the city, overturning cars, smashing windows, and chanting against their own government. What appears to be a spontaneous uprising is actually something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated coup planned thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., where men in dark suits are pulling invisible strings that will reshape the destiny of an entire nation. The Puppet Master, a newly created intelligence agency that most Americans had barely heard of, the Central Intelligence Agency. This moment marked the beginning of an era that would see the CIA transform from a simple information-gathering organization into the most powerful covert intervention force the world had ever known. But how did America, a nation founded on principles of democracy and self-determination, become the architect of secret wars and shadow governments across the globe? The story begins not with dramatic operations in exotic locations, but in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. In December 1947. The world had just emerged from the devastating Second World War, but a new threat was emerging from the East. The Soviet Union, once an ally against Nazi Germany, was rapidly becoming America's greatest adversary. The Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, dividing the continent between democratic West and communist East. President Harry Truman and his advisors faced a troubling question. How could America counter Soviet influence without triggering another world war? The answer came in the form of National Security Council Directive NSC-4A, a document that would fundamentally alter American foreign policy for the next half-century. The Truman administration had become deeply concerned about Soviet psychological warfare, propaganda campaigns, political manipulation, and subversive activities that Moscow was using to expand communist influence. American policymakers watched nervously as countries like Czechoslovakia fell under Soviet control. Through political maneuvering rather than military invasion, they realized that traditional military might wasn't enough to fight this new kind of conflict. What they needed was the ability to fight fire with fire, to engage in their own covert operations without leaving American fingerprints. The CIA was chosen to lead the secret war for pragmatic reasons. The agency controlled unvouchered funds, money that could be spent without normal congressional oversight or public accounting. This meant covert operations could be funded with minimal risk of exposure and no paper trail. The directive authorized the CIA to conduct propaganda operations, engage in economic warfare, perform sabotage missions, support underground resistance movements, and provide assistance to anti-communist elements worldwide. The architects of these programs weren't sinister villains but patriots who genuinely believed they were defending freedom against totalitarian communism. The memory of World War II was fresh, the cost of appeasing Hitler, the price of responding too late to fascist aggression. American leaders were determined not to make the same mistake with communism. They embraced the domino theory, believing that if one country fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow in rapid succession. This worldview justified extraordinary measures, including actions that seemed to contradict the very democratic values America claimed to defend. The legal framework introduced a concept central to CIA activities: plausible deniability. Covert operations had to be designed so that if discovered, the United States government could credibly deny involvement. This requirement shaped everything about CIA operations, from recruiting foreign agents to creating front companies that provided layers of separation between operations and their true sponsor. The opportunity to test the full extent of CIA capabilities came in Iran. Operation Ajax would become a template for future interventions and a cautionary tale about long-term consequences. Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, asserting Iranian control over the country's most valuable resource. For decades, Iran's oil wealth had flowed primarily to British coffers. Mossadegh's nationalization was wildly popular in Iran, but sent shockwaves through London and Washington. When Dwight Eisenhower entered the White House in 1953, He brought John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State and Allen Dulles as CIA Director, two brothers who would drive aggressive covert action. The Dulles brothers saw the world in stark, binary terms. You were either with America and the free world, or you were with the communists. There was no middle ground. The CIA, working with British intelligence, began planning Mossadegh's downfall. The operation was headed by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt arrived in Tehran with a substantial budget and a simple objective: remove Mossadegh and ensure the Shah has complete control. The plan was elegant in its cynicism. The CIA would bribe military officers, religious leaders, newspaper editors, and street thugs. They would organize demonstrations appearing to be spontaneous expressions of popular anger. They would spread propaganda portraying Mossadegh as a communist sympathizer leading Iran to ruin. The operation nearly failed before it succeeded. An initial attempt to arrest Mossadegh was thwarted, and the Shah briefly fled the country. But Roosevelt pressed on, unleashing prepared chaos on Tehran streets. The mobs Americans would see in newsreels were largely paid demonstrators following CIA-prepared scripts. When the dust settled, Mossadegh was arrested, the Shah returned in triumph, and American oil companies received substantial shares of Iranian oil production. From Washington's perspective, it was a complete success. A few $1 million and not a single American soldier. But the long-term consequences proved catastrophic. The coup destroyed Iran's democratic traditions and concentrated power in the increasingly authoritarian Shah. Over following decades, the Shah's regime became synonymous with repression, torture, and corruption, all backed by American support. The Iranian people didn't forget that their democracy had been stolen by foreign powers. When revolution came in 1979, it was violently anti-American. The Islamic Republic that emerged was, in many ways, the direct consequence of choices made in 1953. The CIA had won a tactical victory, but created a strategic disaster that would haunt American foreign policy for generations. Flush with success in Iran, the CIA's next target was Guatemala. The story reveals something important about CIA motivations. While anti-communism was always the public justification, the reality often involved protecting American corporate interests. Guatemala's democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, wanted to redistribute unused agricultural land to landless peasants. This threatened the United Fruit Company, which owned 42% of Guatemala's land. United Fruit had powerful Washington connections. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had done legal work for the company. CIA Director Allen Dulles had served on its board. The CIA launched Operation Success, establishing radio stations that broadcast propaganda, training Guatemalan exiles, and conducting psychological warfare. When CIA-backed rebels crossed the border in June 1954, they were militarily insignificant. But the psychological operation worked so well that the Guatemalan military refused to fight. Arbenz resigned and fled, and the CIA installed military dictator Carlos Castillo Armas, who immediately reversed the land reforms. Once again, long-term consequences were horrific. The coup destroyed Guatemala's democratic traditions and ushered in decades of military dictatorship and civil war. Over the next 40 years, more than 200,000 Guatemalans would die in political violence and genocide, much perpetrated by military regimes enjoying American support. Indigenous Mayan communities were devastated. Entire villages massacred in counterinsurgency campaigns, using techniques taught by American advisors. These early operations established patterns that would repeat throughout the Cold War. A target government would be identified as communist, regardless of accuracy. Corporate interests or geopolitical concerns would drive intervention, but anti-communism provided public justification. The CIA would orchestrate apparent internal opposition using money, propaganda, and covert support. Local military officers would be cultivated and bribed to execute the actual coup. When finished, The United States would install and support an authoritarian regime friendly to American interests, regardless of how it treated its own people. Democracy was always expendable when it produced governments Washington found inconvenient. By the end of the 1950s, the CIA had become a secret army operating on a global scale, with capabilities rivaling many nations' conventional military forces. The stage was set for even more ambitious operations that would draw America into prolonged conflicts and ultimately provoke a reckoning with the costs and consequences of this secret warfare. The confidence that flowed through CIA headquarters in the late 1950s was intoxicating. The successful coups, minimal American casualties, and governments friendly to Washington now ruling in Tehran and Guatemala City. The formula seemed perfect, almost too easy. But hubris, as the ancient Greeks knew well, always precedes a fall, and the CIA's fall would come on the beaches of Cuba, in an operation so spectacular in its failure that it would expose the entire covert operations apparatus to public scrutiny and force a fundamental reckoning with what America had become in its shadow war against communism. Cuba had been America's playground for decades, a tropical paradise, just 90 miles off the Florida coast, where American corporations controlled the sugar industry, where American mobsters ran casinos and nightclubs, and where the dictator Fulgencio Batista ruled with an iron fist while allowing American interests to flourish. But on January 1st, 1959, everything changed. Fidel Castro and his bearded revolutionaries marched into Havana, toppling Batista and promising to restore Cuban dignity and independence. Initially, the Eisenhower administration wasn't sure how to respond to Castro. Some officials thought he might be manageable, another Latin American strongman who could be brought into America's orbit with the right combination of pressure and incentives. But Castro had other ideas. He began nationalizing American-owned properties, redistributing land to peasants, and making increasingly anti-American speeches. When he embraced the Soviet Union and declared himself a Marxist-Leninist, the decision in Washington was made. Castro had to go, and the CIA would make it happen. The plan that emerged was essentially a replay of the Guatemala operation, but on a larger scale. The CIA would recruit, train, and equip Cuban exiles who had fled Castro's revolution, creating an invasion force that would land in Cuba and spark a popular uprising against the communist government. The agency established training camps in Guatemala, where Cuban exiles learned military tactics, weapons handling, and guerrilla warfare. A small air force was assembled, with planes that bore no American markings but were flown by CIA-trained pilots. The landing site chosen was the Bay of Pigs, or Playa Girón, a remote beach on Cuba's southern coast that seemed ideal for an amphibious assault. The operation was codenamed Zapata, and it was approved by President Eisenhower in his final months in office, then inherited by the young, newly inaugurated President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was uncomfortable with the plan from the beginning, but he was also deeply concerned about appearing weak on communism. He had campaigned on the promise of being tougher than Eisenhower on defending American interests, and canceling a major operation against Castro would make him look indecisive. The CIA assured him that the operation would succeed, that Castro's government was fragile, that the Cuban people were waiting for a signal to rise up against their communist oppressors. Allen Dulles, still serving as CIA director, told Kennedy that the chances of success were even better than they had been in Guatemala. What Kennedy didn't fully understand was that the plan depended on assumptions that were fundamentally flawed. The CIA believed its own propaganda about Castro's unpopularity, ignoring intelligence that suggested the revolution actually had substantial support among ordinary Cubans. The agency also assumed that if the invasion force got into trouble, Kennedy would authorize direct American military intervention to save it, something the president had explicitly said he would not do. On April 17, 1961, approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs. Within hours, everything had gone wrong. Castro's forces were waiting for them, having learned about the invasion through intelligence channels and from the poorly concealed preparations. The promised air support failed to materialize because Kennedy, concerned about maintaining plausible deniability, had restricted the number of airstrikes. The Cuban people did not rise up in support of the invaders. Instead, they rallied to defend their revolution. Within 3 days, it was over. More than 100 invaders were dead, and nearly 1,200 were captured. Castro paraded them on television, extracting confessions and exposing CIA involvement for the entire world to see. It was a complete and utter disaster, a humiliation that damaged American prestige and strengthened Castro's position, both domestically and internationally. The Bay of Pigs failure sent shockwaves through Washington and forced a fundamental reassessment of covert operations. Kennedy was furious, feeling that he had been misled by the CIA about the operation's chances of success. He fired Allen Dulles and other senior CIA officials, bringing in new leadership with instructions to reform the agency. More importantly, the failure raised questions that had been suppressed during the triumphant years of Iran and Guatemala. Was overthrowing governments really as easy as the CIA claimed? Were covert operations an effective tool of foreign policy? Or were they creating more problems than they solved? Could an open democracy really conduct secret wars without eventually facing consequences? But even as these questions were being debated in Washington, the CIA was doubling down on its commitment to covert action. The agency became obsessed with Castro, launching a series of increasingly bizarre plots to assassinate him or destabilize his government. Operation Mongoose, approved by Kennedy himself, authorized sabotage operations, propaganda campaigns, and continued efforts to eliminate Castro. The plots ranged from the practical to the absurd: poisoned cigars, exploding seashells, mafia hitmen, and schemes involving Castro's beard and his supposed vanity. None of them worked, and many of them would later seem almost comical if they hadn't been deadly serious at the time. What they revealed was an agency that had lost its way, that was so committed to its objectives that it had stopped thinking critically about whether those objectives were achievable or even wise. The Cuba debacle also marked a shift in how the CIA conducted operations. The agency became more cautious about large-scale paramilitary operations, recognizing that they were difficult to hide and could fail catastrophically. Instead, there was a move toward longer-term, more subtle interventions, supporting friendly political parties, building relationships with military officers who might someday stage coups, conducting propaganda operations that could shape public opinion over time. The focus shifted from dramatic wartime operations to sustained campaigns of political warfare. That might take years to bear fruit. This approach was less likely to result in spectacular failures, but it also meant deeper and more sustained American involvement in the internal affairs of other nations. Meanwhile, American attention was shifting to Southeast Asia, where a new conflict was emerging that would eventually dwarf all previous covert operations in scale and consequence. Vietnam had been divided after the French colonial defeat in 1954, with a communist government in the north and an American-backed government in the south. The CIA had been operating in Vietnam since the mid-1950s, supporting South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem and conducting covert operations against the North Vietnamese government. But by the early 1960s, it was clear that South Vietnam was losing ground to communist insurgents. The CIA's nation-building efforts had failed to create a stable, legitimate government in Saigon, and Diem's increasingly authoritarian and erratic rule was alienating the South Vietnamese people. In a darkly ironic twist, the CIA found itself orchestrating yet another coup, but this time against a government that America itself had installed and supported. In November 1963, with Kennedy's approval, CIA-backed South Vietnamese military officers overthrew and murdered Diem. The agency believed that replacing Diem with military leadership would stabilize South Vietnam and improve the war effort against the communist insurgency. Instead, it opened the door to years of political chaos in Saigon, with coup following coup in rapid succession. The removal of Diem also eliminated any remaining pretense that South Vietnam was an independent nation making its own decisions. It was now clearly an American puppet state, entirely dependent on Washington for its survival. This would have profound consequences as the war escalated, and American ground troops poured into Vietnam, fighting and dying to defend a government that existed only because of American support, and that had no legitimacy in the eyes of its own people. The early 1960s thus marked a turning point in the history of CIA covert operations. The easy successes of Iran and Guatemala gave way to the humiliation of the Bay of Pigs, and the quagmire beginning to emerge in Vietnam. The limitations of covert action were becoming apparent, as were the unintended consequences of intervening in other nations' affairs. But rather than pulling back, the CIA and the national security establishment doubled down, convinced that with better planning, more resources, and refined techniques, they could still achieve their objectives. The stage was set for an even more ambitious phase of covert operations, one that would take the CIA into the mountains of Afghanistan, the jungles of Central America, and into moral territories so dark that it would eventually provoke a crisis of conscience for the nation itself. The 1970s dawned with America mired in Vietnam, its cities burning with protest, and its faith in government institutions crumbling. The idealism that had once justified covert operations, the belief that America was defending freedom against communist tyranny, was giving way to cynicism and doubt. Yet even as the Vietnam War exposed the limits of American power, the CIA was embarking on new interventions across Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. Operations that would reveal an uncomfortable truth: the anti-communist crusade had become a cover for protecting corporate interests, propping up dictators, and crushing democratic movements that threatened American economic dominance. Chile became the laboratory for a new kind of intervention, one that demonstrated how thoroughly the CIA had perfected the art of destroying democracy while claiming to defend it. Salvador Allende was everything American policymakers feared: a Marxist who won power through legitimate democratic elections, taking office as Chile's president in 1970 with a mandate to transform his country's economy and redistribute wealth from the elite to the poor. Allende planned to nationalize Chile's copper mines, which were controlled by American corporations like Anaconda and Kennecott, and to implement land reforms that would break the power of Chile's oligarchy. He was, in essence, attempting to prove that socialism could work within a democratic framework, that a country could choose an alternative to capitalism without Soviet tanks rolling through its streets. For the Nixon administration and the CIA, this was intolerable. If Allende succeeded, it would undermine the entire logic of the Cold War, demonstrating that leftist governments could come to power peacefully and govern democratically. Even before Allende took office, President Nixon ordered the CIA to prevent his inauguration, telling agency officials to make the economy scream and to explore any options for keeping him from power. When those initial efforts failed and Allende was inaugurated, the CIA launched a sustained campaign of economic warfare and political destabilization. The agency worked with Chile's business community to create artificial shortages, funding strikes by truck drivers and shopkeepers that paralyzed the country's economy. CIA money flowed to opposition newspapers and political parties, amplifying every government misstep and creating an atmosphere of crisis. Most ominously, the agency maintained close contact with Chilean military officers, providing them with financial support and assurances that the United States would back a military coup. The CIA understood that Chile's military held the ultimate power, and that if economic chaos became severe enough, if the middle class became frightened enough, the generals would act. On September 11, 1973, they did. Chilean military forces bombed the presidential palace, and Allende died during the assault, either by suicide or murder, the truth forever obscured by the chaos of the day. General Augusto Pinochet seized power, immediately dissolving Congress, banning political parties, and launching a reign of terror that would last nearly 2 decades. Thousands of Chileans were rounded up and taken to the National Stadium, which became a concentration camp where prisoners were tortured and executed. Political opponents were thrown from helicopters into the ocean, their bodies never recovered. The feared secret police DINA hunted down dissidents both inside Chile and abroad, assassinating critics of the regime as far away as Washington, D.C. itself, where former Chilean ambassador Orlando Letelier was killed by a car bomb in 1976. The Chilean economy was restructured according to free market principles, dictated by American-trained economists, with state industries privatized and social programs slashed, creating immense wealth for a small elite while poverty soared among ordinary Chileans. The CIA's role in Pinochet's coup was officially denied for years, but eventually the truth emerged through declassified documents and congressional investigations. The agency had provided funding, intelligence, and encouragement to the plotters, creating the conditions that made the coup both possible and seemingly necessary. American officials justified the intervention with the usual rhetoric about preventing communist expansion, but the reality was simpler and more cynical. Chile had dared to elect a government that threatened American corporate interests, and it had been punished for that choice. Democracy, it turned out, was only acceptable when it produced the right results. Yet Chile was just one front in a broader campaign of covert intervention that swept across Latin America during the 1970s and 1980s. The CIA supported or encouraged military coups in Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, and Uruguay, helping to establish a network of right-wing dictatorships that cooperated in hunting down leftist opponents. This collaboration, known as Operation Condor, turned South America into a killing field where tens of thousands of people disappeared, were tortured, or were murdered for their political beliefs. The justification was always the same. These brutal regimes were necessary bulwarks against communism, and any crimes they committed were acceptable collateral damage in the larger struggle. What this ignored was that many of the victims were not communists at all, but trade unionists, students, priests, teachers, and ordinary citizens who simply wanted social justice and human rights. The CIA's interventions didn't stop communism in Latin America. They traumatized entire societies and created generations of people who viewed the United States as an enemy of democracy rather than its defender. As the 1970s progressed, the CIA's activities began to face unprecedented scrutiny. The Watergate scandal had revealed the dark side of executive power, and Congress was no longer willing to give the intelligence community a blank check. In 1975, Senator Frank Church led a committee investigation that exposed decades of CIA abuses, assassinatio, and plots against foreign leaders including Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba of the Congo. Mind control experiments conducted on unwitting American citizens under the MKUltra program, surveillance of domestic political groups, and routine violations of the agency's charter. The Church Committee's revelations shocked the American public and led to new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future abuses. Presidential findings became required for all covert operations, and congressional intelligence committees were given the authority to review and question CIA activities. But even as Congress was imposing new restrictions, the CIA was preparing for its most ambitious covert operation yet, one that would dwarf all previous interventions in scale and consequence. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, it provided the perfect opportunity for what some CIA officials called payback for Vietnam. Here was a chance to give the Soviets their own quagmire, to bleed their military and destroy their prestige by supporting an indigenous resistance movement, the Afghan Mujahideen, tribal fighters motivated by religious devotion and hatred of foreign occupation. Seemed like the perfect proxy force. The CIA, working closely with Pakistan's intelligence service, began funneling weapons, money, and training to the Mujahideen, starting with relatively modest support that would eventually grow into a multi-billion-dollar program. Operation Cyclone, as the Afghan program was codenamed, represented a return to the CIA's roots in covert action. This wasn't a coup or an assassination plot. It was sustained support for an insurgency, a commitment to a long-term conflict that would grind down Soviet power through attrition. The operation was remarkably successful and its immediate objectives. Soviet forces found themselves trapped in a brutal guerrilla war, suffering thousands of casualties and devastating morale. The Mujahideen, equipped with American weapons including the crucial Stinger missiles that could shoot down Soviet helicopters, inflicted defeat after defeat on a superpower's military. When Soviet forces finally withdrew in 1989, tails between their legs, it was hailed as one of the CIA's greatest triumphs, proof that covert action could achieve strategic objectives without committing American forces. Yet the seeds of future disaster were already being sown. Among the fighters the CIA was supporting, often indirectly through Pakistani intelligence, were Islamic fundamentalists who viewed the conflict not just as a national liberation struggle, but as a religious jihad. The agency's weapons and training were building a network of radicalized fighters who would eventually turn their guns on America itself. One of those fighters was a wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden, who used the Afghan war to build connections and credibility among jihadist circles. The CIA's focus was entirely on defeating the Soviets. What happened after victory was someone else's problem. This short-sightedness would prove catastrophic. When Afghanistan descended into civil war after the Soviet withdrawal, eventually becoming a base for al-Qaeda and the launching pad for the September 11th attacks. Simultaneously, the CIA was deeply involved in Central America, where Nicaragua had become another Cold War battleground. The leftist Sandinista government that took power in 1979 was anathema to the Reagan administration, which saw it as a Soviet beachhead threatening all of Central America. The CIA organized, armed, and trained the Nicaraguan Contras, rebel forces fighting to overthrow the Sandinista government. The Contra War would eventually become one of the most controversial CIA operations ever, not just because of the Contras' brutal tactics and human rights violations, but because the agency's desperation to fund them led to the Iran-Contra scandal. When Congress cut off official funding for the Contras, CIA officials working with National Security Council staff arranged illegal arms sales to Iran, using the profits to continue supporting the Nicaraguan rebels. The scandal exposed a shadow government operating beyond constitutional constraints, convinced that its objectives justified any means and any deception. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 should have marked the end of the covert intervention era. But institutions don't abandon power willingly, and the national security establishment had grown too large, too embedded in American governance, to simply fade away. What the CIA needed was a new enemy, a new threat that could justify continued operations in the shadows. That enemy emerged with devastating clarity on September 11, 2001, when hijacked airplanes struck the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, killing nearly 3,000 Americans and transforming the nation's sense of security forever. The war on terror became the new organizing principle for American foreign policy, and covert operations exploded in scale and scope. But this new era of intervention looked different from the Cold War operations that had come before. Instead of overthrowing governments, the CIA was now focused on capturing or killing individual terrorists, operating in the gray zones of international law with techniques that would have shocked even the Cold Warriors of the 1950s. The agency established a network of secret prisons known as black sites, scattered across Eastern Europe, Thailand, and other locations where suspected terrorists could be held, beyond the reach of American courts or international oversight. Prisoners were subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques, a clinical euphemism for torture methods including waterboarding, sleep deprivation, stress positions, and psychological abuse designed to break their will and extract information. The extraordinary rendition program took covert action to new extremes. The CIA would kidnap suspected terrorists from countries around the world, sometimes snatching them off city streets in broad daylight, and transport them to countries where torture was routine and legal protections non-existent. These operations weren't about gathering intelligence so much as outsourcing brutality, allowing the agency to claim it wasn't technically torturing anyone while ensuring that torture happened. Where people could disappear without trial or charges, held indefinitely in conditions that violated every principle America claimed to stand for. What makes this history particularly tragic is how predictable it was. Every covert operation that seemed like a success in the moment created problems that would metastasize for decades. The 1953 coup in Iran directly led to the 1979 Islamic Revolution, and the hostile relationship between America and Iran that persists today, shaping Middle Eastern politics and threatening to explode into open warfare. The weapons and training provided to Afghan mujahideen in the 1980s helped create the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, organizations that would kill thousands of Americans and draw the United States into its longest war. The support for right-wing death squads in Central America generated waves of refugees fleeing violence, creating migration crises that would become central to American politics decades later. Guatemala, that early triumph of covert action, became one of the most violent societies in the Western Hemisphere, with gangs the pattern repeated endlessly. Short-term tactical success purchased at the cost of long-term strategic disaster. The CIA and its political masters were always focused on the immediate crisis, the urgent need to counter Soviet influence or prevent a leftist government, or stop a terrorist attack. What happened 5, 10, 20 years down the line was someone else's problem. This institutional short-sightedness wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature of how covert operations work. Because they're conducted in secret, there's no public debate about potential consequences. No democratic process to weigh costs against benefits. The small group of officials who approve these operations convince themselves they're serving the national interest, that their superior knowledge and strategic vision justify actions that would be unthinkable if exposed to public scrutiny. The eventual exposure of CIA abuses, the torture memos, the black sites, the rendition flights, sparked national debate about whether America had lost its soul in the fight against terrorism. Critics argued that the CIA had become precisely what it was supposedly fighting against: an organization that operated above the law, that treated human rights as obstacles to be circumvented, that answered to no one and feared no consequences. Defenders countered that harsh measures were necessary in an age of existential threats, that terrorists who would gladly kill millions of Americans deserved no consideration or mercy, that covert operations kept Americans safe even if the public never knew the threats that had been prevented. What is clear from 75 years of covert interventions is that they rarely achieve their stated objectives and almost always create unforeseen consequences that come back to haunt their architects. Governments that seem stable when propped up by CIA support collapse when that support ends, revealing that no genuine legitimacy was ever built. Friendly dictators become liabilities, embarrassments whose brutality eventually becomes too costly to ignore. Insurgent groups armed and trained by the CIA turn those weapons and skills against American interests when their usefulness ends. The blowback from covert operations, a term the CIA itself coined, has shaped global politics in ways that make the world more dangerous and less stable, not safer. Every coup against a democratically elected government, every torture session in a black site, every alliance with dictators and death squads has made American rhetoric about democracy and human rights ring hollow. People around the world don't see America as a beacon of freedom. They see it as a hypocritical empire that preaches democracy while crushing it wherever it threatens American interests. Can a democracy conduct secret wars without losing its democratic character? Can an intelligence agency operate in the shadows while remaining accountable to the people it supposedly serves? Can America build a foreign policy based on genuine respect for other nations' sovereignty? These aren't abstract questions. They raise choices that will define what kind of country America becomes and what kind of world it creates. The CIA's story is ultimately a cautionary tale about power without accountability, about good intentions corrupted by secrecy, about the seductive belief that the ends justify the means. It's a reminder that every shortcut has a cost. Every compromise with principle opens the door to greater compromises. Every intervention creates a new crisis that will demand new interventions in an endless cycle. Breaking that cycle requires courage, the courage to admit past mistakes, to reject the comfortable certainties that have guided policy for decades, to imagine a different kind of relationship, with a world based on partnership rather than domination. The shadows have kept their secrets long enough. It's time to bring America's covert wars into the light, to have an honest reckoning with what was done in the name of national security, and to decide whether this is truly who we want to be. The choice isn't between safety and principles. It is between the temporary illusion of control and the lasting strength that comes from living up to our values. The question is, are we brave enough to choose differently? This is your history. This is your government. This is your responsibility. What will you do with it? The future doesn't have to repeat the past, but only if we have the courage to learn from it.